So we are on Daf Chaf Gimel. Daf Chaf Gimel Amid Base.
Emergency childcare, not school.
That's right. Sorry, Chaf Dalid Amid Base 24b. And we're up to the case of a alleyway that comes off of an alleyway that comes off of a public domain. It comes out for Rishus Harabim. There's an alleyway, and behind the alleyway is a rechava, is a larger than 100 by 50 or 70 by 70 rechava, a backyard that doesn't have any doorways to a house. It's not open to a house. It's lo hukaf ladira. It's not connected to a house, and therefore it's too large, and it's not permissible. And now they want to make it enclosed for living space. So what they did was they opened the doorway from one of the houses into this rechava, and then you would be allowed to carry in there, even though that it's larger. However, the original enclosure is not sufficient. You'd have to change and tear down some of the enclosure or create a new enclosure. So the Gemara is going to try various versions of how to make a new enclosure to this alleyway, to this courtyard, or not courtyard, the backyard, that it was essentially a wood storage area. But this one had an additional component. The additional component is that not only was it an alleyway open to a street, which was on the other end open to the rechava, to this non-living enclosure space, but it also opened up on the other side of the yard. It opened to a small pathway that went all the way to the river, and the river bank was tall enough that it counted as a 10 tefachim wall, and therefore it was an enclosure. But that enclosure also doesn't help us because the original enclosure was not for a living space. However, the sides of the alleyway that went from the backyard to the river had openings to a vineyard, and in that vineyard there was living space. So now the question is, what type of enclosure, what kind of addition would be? It was too difficult to tear down the walls and rebuild them, so they were looking for an idea of how they would be able to add something to the existing enclosures in order to create a permission to carry within the backyard this wood storage area, now that it has an opening from a house to that yard. And that's this case. So the Gemara tells a story. Where are we? Hahi Rechava. This is about the 6th or 7th line into Chav Dalet Amid Base 24b. Hahi Rechava, this backyard, which did not have an opening to a house, and therefore, and it was larger than base assign was larger than 100 by 15, so you were not allowed to carry in there because it was not a livable enclosure or made for a living enclosure. The Hava B'Pum Nahara, it was in this place Pum Nahara. The Chad Gisa Hava B'Siach Lamata. One place was open to an alleyway that went to the street. The Chad Gisa Hava Pasach L'Shvil and Shvil Shekram. And the other side was open to a path that went to a vineyard. And that alleyway, that path that went through the vineyard went all the way to the river. Amar Abai, and the river had a bank that was 10 tefachim high, which is already a wall. Amar Abai said, Hechi Navid, what should we do to permit carrying in here? In other words, to make a new enclosure that will now allow it to be considered an enclosure for living space, now that there's an opening to living space. What addition can we make to make this considered a new enclosure? As we saw yesterday and the days before, that a karpef, a wood storage area, or a chava, which is a backyard, which is also a wood storage area, is only permissible to carry within either it is less than Beis Hasayim, less than 100 by 50, or it is larger than that. However, before you enclosed it, there was an opening from a house to that backyard, to that wood storage area, which makes it a part of the living quarters. And now this wasn't previously enclosed already, so you're gonna have to tear down some of the wall, and that's too difficult. So we're gonna add to the wall somehow, and we're looking for where can you add that would define it as a new enclosure and therefore permissible to carry. So he said, what should we do about it? Should we go ahead and add a wall to the end of the path that goes to the river? That's not going to help, because you already have a wall at the river, the bank. The wall of the river itself is a wall. Adding wall to wall is just extending the height of the wall, and that's not going to be sufficient. Later, we'll see that there are some cases that may work, but not in this case, on account of that adding to the wall is not adding anything, because to no dwellers, not the people living in this courtyard, and no one lives out in the water, and therefore there is no one to whom this addition of a wall counts as a wall. So you already have a wall, you're just making the wall taller, that's not going to count. Making a wall on top of a wall doesn't work. So it says, okay, so why don't you go ahead and between the path of the vineyard and the backyard, why don't you go ahead and make a doorway? Just make a door frame, and the door frame itself is making a new enclosure, a separation between the path and the backyard. And this, by doing so, you have now created a new wall to the backyard, and that should be sufficient. So he says, no, that's not going to work, because the
Tues of Pesach functions for the path or functions for the rochav.
It's going to work for both, because since it works for the path, because the path it has a new opening, so it's also going to work for the backyard. It works as a separator, because since it works for the path as a proper enclosure, it's also going to count as a new enclosure for the backyard. So he said, no, the problem with that is that the path in a vineyard is narrow enough. By adding a doorway which is narrower, the camels that come to drink from the river are just going to knock it down. It's not going to last, and so that doesn't count as a proper enclosure, because it won't last. Elam Abai said, rather, Abai said, "Lavid lechia pischa deshvil shekramit." So Abai says, I got a better idea. What you should do is, instead of a doorway there, make a lechi, and that a vertical post. And a vertical post doesn't have to be very thick. In fact, it could just be a thin layer of paint, as we saw earlier. And so all you have to do is make some hecker, some notice at the end of the path between the vineyard path and the backyard. And by doing so, you've now enclosed properly the vineyard path. And so that will also work as a separation and a divider for the backyard. And that's a new enclosure for the backyard, and that should work. And you're not concerned about the camels tearing that down, because it doesn't have to be any thickness. The Migan, the Mahani, the Shvilsha Krumim, again, since it's going to work to enclose the path of the vineyard, which now has 4 walls, Mahani, Namilor Chaba. And it's going to work also for the backyard. Amalei Rava. Rava says, no, I have a problem with that. What's going to happen is people are going to say, look at Fisher's backyard, which was not enclosed, which larger than 100 by 50, was larger than Beis Hasayim, and it was not enclosed for livable space. And all he did was he added a lechi, and that's going to be sufficient. Or look at Fisher's path to the vineyard. All he did was added a lechi, and that was sufficient. In general, he's going to say that that's going to work, even though it doesn't have the third wall at the back with the riverbank, and so it wouldn't work generally, but over here it works simply because it has the two walls of the path to the vineyard. In addition to that, it also has the bank, the river bank, as the third wall, and so the lechi at the front would work. But usually it wouldn't, because vineyards usually are open through and through, and so you would need more than just the lechi on one side. But people are going to say, look, it worked over there; it should work for us as well. So Rava was concerned that even though you're right, Abaye, it would work in this particular case, but we shouldn't allow it because people won't know the halacha, and they're gonna compare it to somewhere else and say it's permissible. Elama Rava, rather Rava said, Avdinin lechi lepischa damasa. So rather, what we need to do is you need to make a lechi, a vertical post, at the opening to the alleyway. That leads to the city, to the public, the Rishus Harabim, the public domain. And by doing so, you will now separate the mavui, which is the alleyway, from the courtyards, separate it from the backyard. And as Rashi points out, and that wouldn't be sufficient alone, because you still need a separation between the mavui and the street. But that's obvious, and that any case we would have had. So we're talking about a case that you already have a doorway frame at the front of the alleyway between the Rishus Harabim, between the public domain and the mavui, because you always need a separation there. And since you have a tzuras HaPesach, you have a door frame at the front of the alleyway, and now you added a lechi, a vertical post at one corner where the mavui, the alleyway, joins the backyard. So now it has separated the two. So since that works to enclose the mavui and make it a separate alleyway, so too that will also separate the backyard, and now the backyard has a new enclosure, and that's going to count it, and that's going to make it a valid new enclosure. Since this vertical post works for the alleyway where people live, and they can now walk in and out of their backyard with holding things, it'll also count for the backyard to make it a new enclosure, and it's going to work. Hilkach. Now, based on that, to carry in the road that's between that's in front of these courtyards, that's going to be its own space. So of course you can carry within there as long as they have an eruv. They should have a joint meal, but the enclosure works for that. And you carry within the backyard, which now has a livable enclosure, is also going to be permissible because it's its own space. However, the masa or masa. But what about carrying from the alleyway to the backyard and vice versa? Now, for that, we're going to have a machlokas. Pligabar of Achav Ravina. Rav Achav and Ravina are going to disagree. Asar Chad, one says it's permissible, one says it's prohibited. And now we go to Chafei Amid Aleph, and the Gemara is going to say, of course, in truth, they are now both private domains that are enclosed for livable space, and there is nobody living in the backyard that didn't join the meal, and so therefore, for sure, you're allowed to carry from one to the other in and of itself. However, there's a concern. Right now, no one's living in the backyard, but it's a large piece of land. Eventually, somebody may put a new house in there, and now you're going to have a dweller that lives in the backyard, which is a separate domain from the alleyway, and he doesn't have to join the meal and put a meal into the eruv of the alleyway, but people are carrying back and forth from the alleyway to the courtyard and vice versa, and there's not a joint meal. And since that in the eventuality may happen, the one who prohibited said, you can't allow it now because eventually some dweller is going to be there and he's not participating in the eruv meal. Taman the Shari, the one who said it's permissible, the haleket urine. No one lives there. So there's no one that didn't join in the meal, so you can carry from one to the other. Amanda Asar, however, the one who prohibited said that's true for right now. But Zimnin, perhaps at some point, the Havah the Urim, there will be dwellers living in there. The Asil Totula, you're going to carry anyhow, and that's a concern. So that's the end of the previous section of this story, where you have an opening from an alleyway to from a backyard, both to an alleyway and to a path to the river, and the various opinions of how to make that permissible to carry with it. Now, the next parts of the Gemara are going to talk about the previous Gemara had said that if you have a karfe base of sign, if you have a wood storage area, that it is made for, it doesn't have a livable space there, so it's not enclosed for daily living. Maximum size is base of sign, and 100 by 50 or 70 by 70. Now, yours is larger, and you want to be able to carry within there on Shabbos. So you say, you know what I'm going to do? Rather than tear down the wall and rebuild it, I'm just going to fill it with something. And by filling it with something, I'm diminishing its space, and that is going to count as a diminishment. Now, there are two ways of doing this, and the Gemara is going to have various ideas. One is I actually diminish the space. It's no longer 70 by 70. It's no longer 100 by 50. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to fill it with, let's say, trees, or I'm going to cover some of it with an awning or a roof. And by that, I've diminished its space. I've divided it into multiple spaces. And the Gemara is going to see whether or not that works. That's one idea. The other idea is instead of tearing down a wall and rebuilding a wall, I'm just going to build a new wall somewhere in the middle. And by doing so, that has diminished. I've built a new wall. And does that count? And for each one, the Gemara is going to analyze that. So, if you have a storage area that's larger than the requisite amount, which is 100 by 50, and it was not originally enclosed for daily living. And now I want to diminish the size in order to make it permissible to carry. If you just plant trees in the center or somewhere in there, that's not going to count as diminishment. Why? Because after all, trees are just a normal way of living. It's a normal thing to have in your yard, in your wood storage area. You have trees to live on there. Now, even though earlier we said that if you have a courtyard, the trees themselves will not make it into a karpave. That's true because daily living also happens under a tree. But wood storage area is not diminished by the fact that there's a tree in there. However, if you didn't put in trees, but rather what you put in is you put in a post somewhere in the middle of this storage area, you built a platform. This platform is 10 tefachim high, 30 inches, and a minimum of 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim. So you now have you now have a platform of 12 by 12 by 30 inches high, approximately. Great. Now that is a separate space and diminishes from the space. Since it's an independent halachic space, it'll diminish from the area within the courtyard. Pachas migimel lehavami. However, if the platform, even though it's 10 tefachim high, is less than 3 by 3 tefachim, everybody agree that doesn't count. Migimel vadalit. However, from 3 tefachim to 4 tefachim, meaning it's 10 tefachim high, but it is only 3.5 tefachim wide. It isn't a full 4 tefachim wide. So now there's going to be a disagreement. Rabbi Amar Havami. Rabbi says that's sufficient because since it's larger than the loved area, so we see 3 tefachim is sufficient. Rabbi Amar Havami. The Rabbi says no, that's not sufficient because we know a proper platform to have its a halachic space, independent halachic space to be counted as itself, separate from the domain it's in, has to have 4 by 4, and this doesn't have 4 by 4. It won't work. And Rav Amar since it's not 4 by 4, it doesn't count. It's not sufficiently significant to count as its own space. Another question where instead of building a platform in the midst of or a beam in the midst of this courtyard, what he did was he built a wall along the side of one of the walls, and in the images that I've seen, they're all the full length of the wall, but actually the halacha is it doesn't have to be the full length. You build another wall within the courtyard 10 amos long, and since we saw earlier that the way to redefine an enclosure is by tearing down 10 amos and rebuilding 10 amos, so too over here, if along one wall you built a 10 amma long wall, which diminished, which that'll count as a new enclosure, and therefore 10 amas of a new enclosure is going to count as a wall. Is it going to count as a new enclosure? And it'll be hukaf ladira. Since once you already have a house open to there, now you add a 10 amma wall. It's going to be sufficient to say that you've enclosed this for the intent of livable space because you already have a house open to it. Now, the Gemara is going to say there's a caveat. It needs to be that this wall is at least a certain distance from the original wall, because if it's just right against the wall, then all you've done is added to thickness of the wall, but you haven't made a new enclosure. In order to be defined as a new enclosure, it must have a significant distance from the previous wall to count as an independent wall on a new enclosure. So the Gemara says, if he moved from the original wall 4 tefachim and created a new wall, as we said, of 10 amos long, and he made a new mechitza, a new wall, that will work because he's now created a new enclosure, and since there's a new door from a house open to there, so it's livable space, and you made a new enclosure for that living space, so it's going to be fine. However, if it's less than 3 tefachim away from the original wall, so there's lavud. You have an original wall, and then you have another enclosure that's within 3 tefachim, which we say is as if it's solid. It's as if it's not an existent gap space. Well, then it counts as you've just thickened the old wall, but you haven't made a new enclosure. So it's not going to work. However, Migimel Vadalid, what about if the gap is more than 3 tefachim but less than 4 tefachim? So it's more than, say, 10 inches but less than 12. So Rabbi says it works because, after all, it's not loved. Rabbi says it will not work, even though loved doesn't make the old wall count as a part of the previous wall. So it is separate. There's a gap there, but the gap is an insignificant gap because, as we said, the minimum for a requirement for a independent space is 4 tefachim. And this has less than 4 tefachim, so it's not an independent space. So it's true, you made a new enclosure and it's not a part of the old wall because it's more than 3 tefachim away. So it's not considered just a part of the previous material, and it's not enclosed, it's not connected, but it isn't an independent space between there, and therefore it's not sufficient. So Rabbi says it's sufficient because it's not loved, it's not connected to the previous wall. And Rabbi says it's not sufficient. Since it's not 4 tefachim, it doesn't count as a valuable or important enough space, and it's insignificant, and will not count as a new enclosure. However, for this, Rav Simi said masni lekula. Rav Simi said, no, I'm going to say that that this, everybody agrees that 3 tefachim is going to be sufficient to say, oh, it's a separate enclosure. The question, the machlokas, is only if it's less than 3 tefachim. And there Rabbi said it's valid enough, and Rava said, no, it's not valid because it's not loved. The Gemara is going to give us another way of diminishing this space, and this is by rather than building a new wall, this fellow built just put an additional layer of cement along the wall, and enclosed it in a added thickness to the wall. So talk by tit. If we added thickness to the wall by adding a layer of cement, now that diminishes the space. So he was exactly at 100 by 50 plus a little bit, and he figures, you know what? I'm at 5,000 square alma. If I just put a layer of cement along the entirety of the wall, I will be just under 5,000 square alma, and that's going to be sufficient to have diminished its space. So so if the cement is thick enough and strong enough that it can stand even if the bricks were not there, 10 tefachim high can stand, 30 inches high of this cement can stand even though there's no wall, so then that's sufficient to say you've diminished it. But if it cannot stand on its own, Rabba says still it's going to count as a diminishment after all. The space is diminished because of the cement. Who cares whether it can stand alone or not? Right now, there's a wall there. It's standing, so you don't have a 5,000 square amma space. And Rava says, no, it's not going to be sufficient. So Rabba Amavamid Hashem Yakoin, because right now it's there, so you have less space in this space. Since it cannot stand on its own, Rabba says it doesn't count as a diminishment of the space. The enclosure itself is the wall, and the wall is 70 by 70 or 100 by 50. Hirachik minatel daled v'asa. So in this next case is talking about where the enclosure was made by 3 walls, and the 4th wall was a hillside. And the hillside was steep enough, as we saw earlier, that it counts as a halachic wall. What counts as a halachic wall? It is 10 tefachim high within 4 amos long. So within, let's say, 6 feet, it goes up to 30 inches. Which said would the incline is somewhere between 23 and a half and a 25-degree incline. So that enclosure is 3 walls plus a hillside. And now you built a wall within that hillside, the same as we saw before, where you added to the enclosure by adding a wall. But here, instead of adding a wall to an existing wall, in front of an existing wall, you added a wall to where the hillside is. So the Gemara is going to have various versions of this. Of course, if you moved it with more than 4 tefachim in front of the hillside, that's going to be valid. It's just like you moved 4 tefachim in front of a wall. Pachas megimel. If you put it, however, if you moved it less than 3 tefachim from there, meaning it's basically up against the hillside, you built a fence, that's not a new enclosure. The enclosure is already there, and this is a part of the previous enclosure. Or, similarly, al svasatil, you built on top of the incline. So you have an incline, and then you built a fence on top of that. That's also not going to do anything. That's not a new enclosure because you're building a fence on top of a fence. A fence on top of a wall, a halachic wall that you're just extending upward. So al svasatil. Now, Rav Chisda and Rav Amnuna. There's a machlokas Rav Chisda and Rav Amnuna. One says that's a good enough enclosure, a new enclosure. And one says no, it's not a good enclosure. It's not a new enclosure. And the Gemara wants to prove who said which. Let's prove that Rav Chisda says that it is a sufficient enclosure. The Itma we said, somebody makes a fence on top of a fence. And as we'll see in a moment, the scenario is different than what we saw earlier today, where putting a fence over the riverbank, everybody agreed would not work. As I mentioned there, because it's not a fence, it's not a new fence to anybody. To the people living in the alleyway by the vineyard, it's not a new fence because they already have a wall of the riverbank. And to the people in the river, it's not a new enclosure because it's also a part of nobody lives there. However, in our case, what we're going to see is that the case is that it's a valid enclosure for some and not for the other. For one side, it's a good enclosure. For the other, it isn't. But since it's good for one, it's good for the other, according to Rav Chisda. So, somebody makes a wall on top of an existent wall. So, Amar Rav Chisda says, B'Shabbos, hoil. On Shabbos, it's going to work. It's going to be a valid enclosure. And you can carry there. However, in regards to making an acquisition of ownerless property, it will not count as an acquisition. Generally, we say ownerless property is hefker, something that somebody relinquished ownership to. But the case the Gemara is talking about is nichse ager, a convert who converted and has no descendants and has no immediate family, because a convert is like a newly born person. So this person has no heirs. So it's ownerless property, essentially. But any type of hefker, any type of ownerless property that is now in a piece of property, so I can acquire it by acquiring the land. This is called kinyan agav. If you acquire real property, that you can acquire movable property along with it. So if I make a fence on the real property, will I now acquire the movable property that's in it? And therefore, my building this fence on top of an existing fence is not going to count. And somebody else who does a proper acquisition to this real property will acquire it. However, if Sheshas says, "Af b'Shabbos nam lehoil," and for Shabbos also, it would not be sufficient. To stayim, so that's proof that it's a valid wall. And that Rav Chis is the one who says it's a valid wall when you build on top of the other. Rav Chis said, "I'll tell that if you put Rav Shesha is going to agree to me that if you put a wall on top of a hillside, then it's going to be sufficient. That it works. My time because the people living on, it's true for the people on the lower side of the tail of the incline, to them there's no additional value in the fence above, because you already have the incline as a halachic wall, and then you added a wall above there, and they're dwelling within the confines or the protection of the lower wall, which is the hillside. However, for the people living on the top of the hill, the enclosure that's made above the hillside, actually that fence is valuable to them. They are living within that enclosure, so to them this is a real enclosure. Since he's living within that upper enclosure. So by Rabbi Baruch Chana asked, you built an upper enclosure above the lower. So let's say you had a fence 10 tefachim high, and you added to the fence another 10 tefachim. Now it's 20 tefachim high. It's insignificant in regards to this enclosure. You haven't added to the enclosure. It doesn't count as a new enclosure, and therefore you're not allowed to carry in there. But what happened is that over time, the wall sunk into the ground, so much so that all that you see right now is the 10 tefachim above, or enough soil and soot came up along the wall, then now the ground rose up. Either way, whichever way it is, then the original enclosure is no longer there, and you only have the new enclosure. Do we say, look, my additional fence it helped? Now, lamai. So Gemara says, in regards to which one of these subjects are you asking? Are you talking about to the acquisition of ownerless property? This is similar to the teaching of Yirmiyah Bira. The Amar Yirmiyah Bira. Yirmiyah Bira said, Amar Yehuda, name of Yehuda. Haiman the Shad Lifta Apila Diara the Ger. Somebody who tossed a turnip into the property of a nichsei ger, of ownerless property. So he wants to acquire the real property of this person who passed away without heirs, and he says, okay, there's a ditch right there, and as we saw in Shabbos multiple times and in Brachas, that they would keep their vegetables fresh. Their root vegetables would be put back into soil, into the ground, in a ditch, and that kept it moist and fresh. They didn't have refrigerators. So this fellow says, okay, I'm going to show ownership here by tossing a turnip into a ditch or a hole in the ground, and by doing so, I've shown that this is my show ownership, and I make an acquisition. So that's not going to be sufficient. But a different person came to acquire this land, and what he actually did was he dug in there. He started tilling the ground. So Basra Kani Kamalikani, the second fellow is the one who acquired it. The first fellow didn't. The reason is because that's a real chazaka, that's real active acquisition, showing of ownership by tilling the ground. Tossing a vegetable into a ditch doesn't count as a show of ownership, and therefore it doesn't count as a form of acquisition. So look, honey, so he's not going to acquire it. My time, be'idna the shadalei kashavach. It's true when he tossed the turnip in there, it is not, it's beneficial to the ground. It increased its value perhaps, but it's something that happens on its own. But the fellow who tilled the ground, he's actually doing something to it. Indian Shabbos, so must be that you're talking about in regards to Shabbos. The question is whether or not the collapsing of the lower walls and the upper walls still standing is going to count. Well, if this happened on Shabbos itself, it's a barrier that happened on Shabbos, and a barrier that happens on Shabbos is not kosher. Sorry, it counts as regardless of whether you built it on Shabbos intentionally, unintentionally, it counts as a proper enclosure. To which Gemara says no. We only said that in regards to its proper enclosure, that if somebody carries from a public domain into this enclosed space, on a Torah level, it's going to count as an enclosure. But we don't value it as an enclosure because it was made on Shabbos. Shema mechitza, lav itmar la. So Gemara says, didn't we say Amar Nachman L'shono El Lizroik, that it's only true in regards of carrying from the public domain into the private domain? But to carry within the space, it's not enough of an enclosure because it was made on Shabbos. So it's going to be prohibited. The Gemara says no. Of course, it is a valid enclosure, even if it was made on Shabbos. The prohibition of carrying within there is only if it was done intentionally, because you don't want to benefit from a transgression of Shabbos. Itmar, it was said, a woman made a extended upward a fence around property in order to acquire property of someone who had no heirs. Also, Gavra, Rafik Bapurta, and somebody else came and started tilling the ground. Also, they came before Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman said, look, the first enclosure doesn't count because it was already enclosed by a fence. You just added to the fence. That's not doing anything to acquire the land. The one who tilled it is the one who acquires it. So she came complaining in front of him and said, wait, I was the first one to get there, and I did something to the land to increase its value. So I showed ownership, so it's mine. He said, well, what can I do for you? You didn't do what a proper show of ownership. A proper show of ownership for real property is you have to do something to the land itself. And what you did was you enclosed an existing enclosure. You added to the top of the fence. That's not sufficient. Back to Eruvin. So karpef bei sholosh v'kira by beisa. You have an enclosure that is a karpef, which is prohibited, and what he did was he enclosed a third of it, meaning it has 50 by 100, and what he did was he enclosed 33 by 50. So sorry, it's larger. That's 2 beisa. It was a 3 beisa. So it had 50 by 150, and he he covered with a roof 1 beisa. So 50 by 50 of the 150 by 50 he covered, and what remains is an unroofed, uncovered 100 by 50, which is the maximum allowed. But he actually enclosed the third beisa. So the ear space of the covered space, which is now a private domain and is considered an enclosure for living space, and it's going to be permissible. So it's going to be prohibited on account of that the open space to the, even though that it is covered, but it's included in the same space. And he says no. it's not going to be considered one large space because the opening, the covered space has an opening. That opening is going to be considered closed because the roof of the 50 by 50 is as if it comes down and makes a wall there. This is called P Tikra Yored Vesos, and we saw this earlier that the depth of the roof, that thickness, is going to be sufficient to count as a halachic wall between the area that has a roof and the area that does not have a roof. And therefore, the remaining space is just 100 by 50, which is the maximum allowed. And therefore, you can carry in the 100 by 50, and you can carry, obviously, in the place that has a roof, because that's a separate space. What about Leimer Rava and Rav Zera beplukta de Rav Shmuel? So let's say the machlokas between Rav and Rav Zera over here in regards to having covered over part of the space would be similar to a machlokas in regards to a gazebo, a type of achsadra, which is essentially a roofed-in area but has no walls. Please, the itma we learned achsadra bebika. Somewhere out in an open field, you have an achsadra, this pop-up tent, if you would. Rav Amar mutal talta bakula. Rav says you can carry within its space, and Shmuel says you can only carry 4 amos. You can only carry in the space. It's only within 4 amos the space that the item was itself. So Rabbi Mamutal Taltabakula, he says you're allowed to carry in the whole thing because we say P Tikra Yored Vesosing, that the thickness of the roof is as if it comes down and makes a wall, and so it's a fully enclosed space halachically. Shmuel says you may not carry only within its own space 4 amos because we don't say this concept of the thickness of the wall of the roof itself. That mini wall at the top of the alongside the roof is coming. It would come down and enclose it. The so Gemara says that would be fine. You're right if in the courtyard. That you made such an enclosure, it would like be achsadra achanami, then even Rabbah would agree that pitikra yored v'sosim, and it would be sufficient. However, there's a distinction. Our case is talking about where Rav says that the roof did not work. The avdaki arzila. The reason is because there isn't a flat side of the wall, which now you can say comes straight down, but rather it was done on a slanted in roof. And therefore, there is no P-tikra, there is no mouth to that wall that you could say that comes down and encloses. This concept of P-tikra is going to come up a lot, and this is a basic idea of that when you have a beam, a cross beam, that is the support for your roof. That crossbeam has a thickness. That thickness itself will define the end space of the area beneath it, and it will count as a wall. However, if I don't have a thickness there, because the roof is made on an angle, so that beam that's supporting the roof is actually slanted, and therefore I don't have a thickness of a wall that I can say is coming down. It comes to a point. And since it comes to a point, I'm not going to say P Tikra Yored V'Sosim.